lunar ambassadors. I think it is tremendously overdue that we honor and acknowledge the incredible service of these military and civilian astronauts who literally climbed on the equivalent of a nuclear bomb, which is what the Saturn V represented in terms of explosive power if something went radically wrong. They climbed on top of this bomb. They went to the moon, 500,000 miles, came back, round trip, and they have basically been stuck in limbo, military limbo, in terms of their promotions for the last 40-some years. Well, I'm hoping that with your audience and many other audiences, we can write to President Obama, and we can change that, because with a stroke of a pen, our Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States, can elevate all of these individuals. And I think it would be very appropriate in the year that politically they're going to acknowledge that we're not alone, that the men, who walked on the moon and who orbited the moon and who are those incredible pioneers actually receive the acclamation that they are long, long overdue.
What do you make then of NASA as a military program? Does that need to be pointed out as well? I mean, we might be talking about the U.S. military going on kind of recon missions, if you will, to Mars and to the moon and checking things out.
I think you put your finger on a very important thing, because when you look back and you ask yourself, well, why have these men, certainly the military officers, not received any promotions? I mean, when you look at militaries all over the world, including the Swedish military or the Norwegian military or France or India or Russia or the United States, meritorious service is constantly being rewarded by a bump up in rank. That remarkably, and this is really interesting to me the more I think about it, that did not happen with the men who went to the moon. And it didn't happen in retrospect. It didn't happen in the last 40 years. And I'm frankly wondering if it didn't happen because if NASA and the President and the command structure of our military had done that, had taken these Navy veterans or Air Force veterans or Marine Corps veterans who had, gone into NASA and who had become astronauts and then gone to the moon and come home, if it had actually elevated them in rank because of their trips to the moon and their exploration, what it would have done in the minds of the American people is to reignite the whole question, well, what did they find on the moon? And then, of course, handling this bizarre political nonsense which has been running around for the last 40 years that we never went to the moon, the so-called moon hoax crowd. And I think that it was, we have a saying here, let sleeping dogs lie. I think there was a conscious political decision made to not go anywhere near these men, because if they did, if they acknowledge their service by raising their profile, then right behind it would come the questions, well, what did you find? And if it wasn't time to reveal what's on the moon, the extraordinary artificial ancient ruins that the Apollo astronauts brought pieces home to laboratories here to be analyzed, and for which they have obviously all been sworn to absolute secrecy, I think that rationale probably politically, from their perspective, makes some sense. But to come back to Colonel Aldrin, the day on the 40th anniversary, when everyone was discussing the ancient, we went to the moon 40 years ago, Buzz Aldrin appears on a major American network called C-SPAN, which is a political network which covers all the comings and goings of, the legislature, the Senate, and the House on Capitol Hill here in the United States, and the goings-on of the White House and all the political ramifications of policy, et cetera, et cetera. Aldrin goes on C-SPAN and suddenly says, oh, we really shouldn't go back to the moon. We should go to Mars, but we should go to Phobos because, and then he hauls out a model on network television and says, there's a monolith on Phobos. We don't know who built it. Probably God built it, but people are going to ask who built it. So he created a cascade interest at a subtext level in the idea that there may be something artificial connected with Phobos. That was a year ago. And then this spring, we have the new ESA imagery and radar and leaks coming out from the investigatory teams on ESA from inside, particularly the radar team, that in fact Phobos is artificial and filled with ancient rooms and bulkheads and doors and whatever, and that information ultimately is going to make its way into the general public data stream. And if I didn't see a political drip, drip, drip in that progression of events in terms of time, then I guess I don't know how to analyze politics, but that's the picture that I see.
And we have a number of other things obviously happening in terms of Phobos as well. The Russian Phobos grunt in 2012 as well is going to.
Oh my gosh, yes! And notice the timing. Well, the Phobos grunt mission, which is a follow-on to the former Soviet Union's 1989 mission, 2 missions to Phobos, called Phobos 1 and 2, very imaginatively. Back then, the Russians in '88 had launched 2 unmanned robots to not go to Mars, but to go to Phobos, orbiting, less than 4,000 miles above the surface. And one mission failed en route for reasons that we don't really understand. But the second mission, Phobos 2, made it to Mars, made it into orbit, and actually made it within, a couple of 100 kilometers of Phobos before it also mysteriously died. Well, before it did, it radioed back information. Telemetering is what it's called. And this information appeared in actual peer-reviewed scientific papers in some of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world, like Nature. And in those papers, in 1989, the Soviet Union claimed, based on its in situ observations with Phobos 2, that they had discovered that Phobos, the inner moon of Mars, is 1/3 hollow. Furthermore, they detected a wake in the solar wind behind Phobos as it interacted with both the solar wind and the Martian atmosphere. And they concluded from that data, which again is in peer-reviewed papers published in Nature in 1989, that Phobos is leaking some kind of fluid, probably water, which is interacting with the solar wind and producing anomalous plasma and magnetic readings, which the Phobos 2 spacecraft dutifully picked up as it orbited Mars and crossed this wake. Think of, kind of like a rock on a stream with the water flowing past it, and you've got a wake downstream. Well, the Phobos spacecraft detected the electronic signatures of something, water vapor, leaking out of Phobos. Well, if you're looking at a little rock less than 20 miles across that's billions of years old and has been there since the beginning of the solar system, in the relatively warm environment of a moon orbiting as close to the sun as Mars, which is 1.5 times as far from the sun as we are, there's really no plausible mechanism whereby water in an asteroid, let's say is ice under the surface, would have survived for those eons and still be leaking, escaping from Phobos. It's just not in the numbers. However, if Phobos is, as we now firmly believe based on the data that we've been analyzing from ESA, if Phobos is in fact an ancient spacecraft, a huge space station of some kind, a manufactured object which has been bashed and battered by meteor strikes on the exterior, but in fact has preserved areas on the interior, including rooms that actually are containing an environment, an atmosphere, as the leaks, pun intended, coming out of ESA that we wrote up on the Enterprise mission website in terms of our Phobos paper a few weeks ago now tend to indicate, then it all comes together, and yes, the Russians, the Soviets back in 1989 merely detected another example of why Phobos is in fact not natural but is artificial, and it becomes part of the accumulating database, which will then be acknowledged officially, if my political projections are correct about the timetable, sometime this year, 2010, the year we make contact, because that would be the safe route to ultimately, probably in 2012, saying, oh, and by the way, guys, guess who's coming to dinner?
This also brings me back again, obviously, to Arthur C. Clarke, his story about rendezvous with Rama, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Classical. I mean, look, he's basically laying out the pattern. Rama was this big spaceship. It was named Rama from the most ancient terrestrial culture that probably still knows the human race is not alone, which is the Vedic culture, India. And look at the extraordinary role that India is now playing in terms of its current space programs, vis-a-vis both the American space program, NASA, the European space program, ESA, and the Russian space program. I mean, the Indians, I believe, are part of this return that the Russians are now planning, as you said appropriately a couple of minutes ago, because following their 1989 mission, the Phobos 1 and 2 missions, they now have a mission scheduled to leave in 2011